Hey folks, Taylor here. Before we get going, I wanted to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by our old pals, Fucci. They make the highly engineered soccer rebounder that combines soccer and squash. We love it. We've played it. You can find video of us playing it on YouTube. They've also got a whole new line of apparel for you to check out. Given that today's show hits on ideas intended to help U.S. soccer rebound, this seemed like a logical approach. Best of all, our listeners can get 15% off any Fucci item using the promo code TSS2018. That's TSS2018 to get 15% off any order. A link to their site is in today's show notes. Thank you as ever to Fucci for sponsoring the program. Now on with the show. And welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I am Taylor Rockwell. No Daryl Grove on today's show, so we are 100% less English, but a lot more political. Because instead of Daryl, I talked to U.S. soccer presidential candidate Michael Winograd. With 5 days to go until the election, Michael took time out of his, I'm assuming, packed schedule to cover a wide range of topics, including youth development in the United States, equal treatment for women's soccer, promotion relegation, and his thoughts on the legal issues regarding solidarity payments. Lots and lots of info there. So if you either aren't familiar with Michael or you want to be as informed as possible when it comes to the election, then I would say that this show is definitely worth your time. And with that said, joining me now, I've got U.S. soccer presidential candidate Michael Winograd. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Appreciate that. Well, first I wanted to start with, I was reading your bio. I saw that you were an assistant coach at the University of Richmond way back when, I'm assuming. What years would that have been, and was that before or after Richmond's economy became about 70% based on craft beer?
It was before the economy became heavily based on craft beer.
Okay.
I don't know what Richmond is like now, but back when I was there, most of the bars, I think, had to close quite early. There was a citywide ordinance. So I don't think any of the craft beers would have done too well back then.
Yeah.
But it was back in 95, 96.
I gotcha.
It was actually the first year that when I went to Richmond, I had just gotten back from playing abroad in Israel. And the coach who had coached me my senior year in college had taken the job at University of Richmond and asked if I wanted to come down and coach with him. I said, absolutely. And it was the year that we hosted the men's Final Four. And to date, I think it's the largest men's Final Four in NCAA soccer history. I think there were about over 40,000 people at a college soccer event.
Was that the year that UVA lost and it's like drive to win 5 in a row? I feel like I remember that.
UVA did lose in the semifinals. I don't remember if that was a drive for 5, but it did lose in the semifinals, and it was a big loss.
It stands out of my heart. I was a UVA fan back then. Less so today. No offense,
Okay.
Cavaliers.
Yeah.
But that was 95, 96. You've obviously done quite a bit since. So for our listeners who don't know much about you or about your campaign, can you give them a quick idea about your background and why you chose to run for office?
Sure. Let me start. I played 4 years of college soccer at Lafayette College in Division I. I played 3 years professionally in Israel after that. When I came back, like I just said, I coached at University of Richmond. After Richmond, I signed a contract with the Rochester Rhinos. The league was starting, the season was starting a few months out after I signed the contract, and they said, hey, you should go play with the Buffalo Blizzard indoors. We think they could use somebody like you for the rest of their season. And I went, and the very first day I blew out my knee. So I decided to apply to law school. I took the LSATs. I couldn't apply till the following fall for entry the fall after that. So I worked a little bit with a good friend of mine who was general manager of an A-League team at the time called the New York Fever. The owner then asked the two of us to start up a new franchise on Staten Island. We did that. I was in charge of everything on the soccer side. My friend was in charge of everything on the business side, the stadium. I hired the coach. I drafted team policies. I started a grassroots program with the local community, picked a team name by basically picking 3 and putting it out to a vote in the Staten Island Advance to involve the community. About midway through, my colleague went to San Jose, where he became the general manager of the Earthquakes the year they won the MLS Cup. I shepherded the team through until I went to law school and set them up. They made it to the, quarterfinals in their inaugural season. And since then, I've stayed involved in soccer. I've been on my local board, my local soccer association board since 2009. I've coached my kids for several years, both in rec and travel. They're now in the DA. And when I went to law school, I went to University of Pennsylvania, graduated with several honors, and ever since, for the last 17 years, have been practicing at really the most prominent law firms in the world, dealing with the biggest companies in the world. I've represented Microsoft and Samsung and FedEx Supply, and the list goes on. Bank of America. So I've also been an adjunct professor of law at Fordham University Law School since about 2003. And really what I do is deal with the biggest companies and their CEOs and boards when they're confronted with their high-stakes, big issues, and, advise, counsel, guide, and, more often than not, figure out a resolution.
So I read your Q&A with the American Outlaws. You noted you don't have any hidden agenda, sponsors, special ties to any constituents. That's
right.
One of the things that sets you apart. It felt like the implication there was that you were saying some of your fellow candidates do have those issues. Were you speaking about anybody in particular, or mostly just focusing on yourself?
I'm really, as I've done throughout this campaign, I've really just focused on myself. I think there, clearly are ties that have been acknowledged or, have not been acknowledged out there, and people can sort of, glean what they'd like and come to their own conclusions. I've really just focused on myself. I think independence is important, and really I just, I'm independent. I don't have ties. I'm objective. I'm fair. I've got the respect of parties on all sides of every aisle, and I've done that remaining independent and saying the same thing to everybody, and that's the kind of ability to achieve a consensus that we're going to need to start building some bridges in U.S. soccer.
Well, that seems like a key jumping off point there would be building of bridges, because it seems like you've got some very specific ideas about how to improve U.S. soccer. One of them I wanted to start with was your thoughts on youth soccer. We saw you at the Presidential Forum in Philly. You talked there about your kids and the Development Academy. Where do you think the Development Academy and U.S. soccer, in terms of youth development, are coming up short? What changes would you like to see implemented in this country?
Well, if you're talking specifically about the DA, the DA is, we've got to look and reevaluate the DA, right? It clearly has done some things very well. It's done some things not very well. One of the things I've talked a lot about is, my son's fortunate enough to have played in the DA. He's playing actually a year up, and the result is that he missed 3 days of school last quarter alone, traveling to games, not tournaments, but just weekend games in Montreal, weekend games in Massachusetts, and all the way down to, Richmond and D.C. So, those are the kind of things that the time commitment and the sort of semi-professional commitment that we're demanding of kids at such a young age seems to me a little bit out of balance. And people have talked about how it's making it overly burdensome, and is probably not striking the right balance. But we've got to work on things like that with the DA. We've got to work on sort of the pay-to-play model and making sure that we're including good players at that level. From all over. What winds up happening, and I've talked a lot about this, when you look at the elite path for the elite athletes trying to become professional, trying to get onto the national team. I've talked about state soccer centers with well-paid state soccer directors in each state. And the reason for that is we need to be more inclusive in the players we're looking at. We cannot, if we're going to pick a national team, rely on just calling up the coaches and the DA and saying, send us your 2 or 3 best players. I understand people are short-staffed, but we've got to do a better job of identifying players across all leagues, regardless of where they are.
So with those state training centers, that was a concept I thought was pretty interesting, especially in regards to like having the state advisor there, a well-paid, competitive position. How would you go about establishing those centers, acquiring the land, building the facilities, things like that?
So first is money, and we've got a very big surplus, and I think the lion's share of the surplus, that's where I'd spend it. I've talked about other places we can spend some of it, but that's really where I put the majority of the surplus. And by the way, we can, this is, we're not talking about, something overly elaborate. We're talking about a building that houses, offices for the state soccer director. It'd be great if we could pull in the state associations into that building. That's a matter of logistics. Some would be for it. Some don't want to move. But it's a simple building with a couple of fields that we can have training sessions, where we can have coaching education, referee education, and a visible home center. I think the surplus would probably cover it entirely. And if it didn't, then we'd have to get money from other sources. I've talked about this in the context of lowering the cost barriers in pay-to-play and coaching education. I've talked about where we can get funding from, and whether it's public grant money or investing more heavily in United States Soccer Foundation, who've figured out that they can go into inner cities and build, not just by using private source funding, but actually tapping into municipal funds that are earmarked for infrastructure development. But one of the other things, and this would obviously equate to the soccer centers, is private equity, private funds. My firm represents the largest private equity firms in the world. I do work for Bain, TPG. These are firms with $75 billion of assets under management. I was in London a few weeks ago with our client, LGIM Properties. I was representing the CEO in a big matter and had conversations, several conversations with him. They funded the development of St. George's Park, the state-of-the-art FA training facility in England. I speak their language. Those are the kind of folks that we need to give incentives to invest here in the U.S. and help build things like the state soccer centers.
So when you say incentives, what did you envision there? How would you get them involved, and what kind of return on investment do you think you might be able to promise?
I think it's the same. It's the same things that led LGIM Properties to invest in the FA. Mm-hmm. There is publicity, there is marketing, there is a market. Remember, U.S. soccer has got tremendous leverage. It's got a mass base population. You can bring companies in and say, listen, this is tremendous advertising for you. We'll post your name on the outside of the building. We'll call it, the U.S. Soccer, State Soccer Center, and have your name, on the field. Have a lot of visible marketing. There are lots of things that big companies will want to do to get their name out into the U.S. soccer community. There are it's getting involved in U.S. soccer the same reason that people go in and sponsor leagues. It's sponsorship. It's getting their name out there. We have a lot to offer. We are a massive market. And what we need to do is sit down with folks that I work with that are, feet away from me on the floors that we have here in New York and in Boston and the other cities, bring in our private equity folks and figure out the presentations that we need to make, sit down with our clients. We have those contacts. We speak that language and figure out ways to get that money in, because it is going in. There is an answer to that because we know that folks are doing it abroad.
You've also talked in other interviews that I've seen about solidarity payments, training compensation. Can you speak a little bit to that? And then with that in mind, I also wanted to ask you about your thoughts. We heard Sunil Gulati talking about that and essentially kind of threatening that the MLS Players Union would sue anybody who pursued that matter. Obviously, you are a lawyer with a established legal background. I'm wondering about your thoughts on that statement.
So solidarity payments, and I've talked a lot about this when I was talking before about the ways to fund pay-to-play, and again, reduce cost barriers. You're not going to get, everything's not going to be free for everybody, but you can reduce cost barriers for those with financial need. You can reduce the costs overall in pay-to-play, coaching, education. The last component, the fifth thing that I've talked about is solidarity payments. And really, on the one hand, if you're successful and you develop a Clint Dempsey and he signs a great contract, you get a chunk of money. There's obviously the direct form of compensation and solidarity payments. But what nobody really talks about is the other form, which is the incentive that it creates. Just the simple possibility of a club being able to earn that payment is an incentive to invest up front. And not just from the club owners, but it gives them a pitch to go to a whole market that we can't get to, the local market, to local businesses, local residents, and say, listen, give some money to my club, not just because it's the right thing to do, not just so we can give scholarships to kids so that people can play based on passion and desire and merit and not family finances. But also, if we get it right like we think we will, you're going to get your money back. So it's a great source of revenue and from a whole different funding source. In terms of the antitrust component, there are two things that have been bounced around. One, is it an antitrust violation? Now, I refuse. I've done some antitrust. We represented Microsoft in its big antitrust cases.
I've heard of them.
Yeah, I worked a lot on the European on the case in Europe and flew around Europe, meeting with the chief information officers of all the biggest companies in Europe in 2001, and interviewing and drafting affidavits and creating evidence for that case. I've done antitrust for University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which was one of its biggest cases, against West Penn Allegheny, sort of front page every day in Pittsburgh. I know a little bit about antitrust, and we can figure this out. It is not going to be an antitrust barrier. There is just no way that we cannot figure out a way to make it work under the antitrust laws in the U.S. With respect to the players can protest. Now, lawsuits, look, to bring a lawsuit, you have to have merit. If you don't have merit, it's just, you're going to be spinning your wheels. But before we ever get to that point, we're going to sit down with the players. We're going to do this inclusively, just like everything else. We can't. The players, when you think about, for example, MLS, the players are the greatest assets. You can't alienate players. You have to involve them. That doesn't mean they're going to like everything you have to say. It doesn't mean you're going to give them everything that they want. But you have to make them a part of the conversation so that they can understand U.S. soccer's interests, U.S. soccer's perspectives, and at least appreciate the rationale and reasoning behind what you're saying. I find it very difficult to believe that we would not be able to sit down with the players in the context of everything, both giving and taking, because there are a lot of things that players at the U.S. soccer level, when we negotiate CBAs, are going to be asking for that we absolutely should give them. But this is part of an ongoing dialogue. We need to include them, and I just refuse to believe that there is a chance that we would not be able to come to a resolution on this.
You mentioned that we can't risk alienating players. It seems like U.S. Soccer has done that on a fair number of occasions when it comes to the women's national team, the women's side of the game. I know that's been a key component of your key strategic initiatives would be equal treatment for women's soccer. What did you envision in terms of helping promote and, I guess, equalize men's and women's soccer, at least on the national team level? Yeah,
this is just, I've said this over and over again. It is stunning to me that we're even having this discussion in 2018. Mm-hmm. When we started this campaign, I was saying it's stunning that we were having the conversation in 2017. There needs to be absolute equality for the women's programs, full stop. And so let me be clear about that. If the men are not playing on substandard fields, then the women will not be playing on substandard fields either, and I don't think anybody should be. If the men are flying first class to games, the women are going to fly first class to games. Whatever technology is available in the men's camps, it's going to be equally as accessible and available in the women's camps. With respect to pay, if there is, if the men and women want the same pay structure, they're going to get equality in pay, dollar for dollar. If the men and women want different pay structures, one wants, less of an upside but more of a guaranteed base, that's perfectly fine. We will figure it out so that there's pay equivalence. But we cannot. There is absolutely no. It's unconscionable that there would be any inequality between the men and women's programs and the support that they get from U.S. Soccer.
Yeah, I'm with you because it does seem kind of insane that in 2018 this is still considered a controversial topic. So I'll just move us on to something less controversial. Let's talk promotion relegation, shall we? That can't get us into trouble. I thought your approach to it was pretty interesting. It's not one that I've seen a lot of other candidates talking about. So can you explain your thoughts on promotion relegation, particularly in regards to the idea of guest spots?
Sure. So, look, promotion, there are a few things that would be as exciting in our pro leagues as promotion and relegation. The fact of the matter is, there's a limit to what U.S. soccer can do. You've got MLS franchises being sold for $150, $200 million. You've got contractual obligations between MLS owners and its league that are binding. And so what we need to do in the first instance to make ProRel a little bit more practical is start focusing on building the profitability and stability of the lower leagues. Start closing the gaps between the lower professional divisions and MLS. As an interim step, what I've talked about is this idea of guest spots. And that may not be a today thing, it may not be a tomorrow thing, but it's certainly a nearer-term thing that we could use to begin the discussion, get people's feet wet, socialize the idea, and actually get something implemented and see how it goes. And what I meant by guest spots is very simple. When you think about MLS and their biggest concern, they've bought they've bought franchises and they've bought into an entity, and they don't want to risk being dropped down. So what you say to them is, you guys are all the MLS teams are grandfathered in. You have no chance of getting relegated. You're not eligible for relegation. But we'll open up 2 guest spots, for example, for promotion. And so 2 teams from the lower divisions will get promoted into MLS. At the end of the season, if one of those teams finishes in the bottom 4, that team gets relegated and the guest spot opens up for promotion. If that team finishes above the top 4, then that team stays in MLS. It is an idea that is at least, again, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but at least in a nearer term more practical to start heading towards a true promotion relegation and give people a chance to see how it works. But again, I think the first focus really needs to be building the profitability, the stability of the lower divisions, getting them into more markets, and closing that gap.
That makes sense. I did want to clarify. So when you're with the guest spots, I totally agree about developing the lower leagues. But with those 2 guest spots, would that be something where you would try to incentivize Major League Soccer to just award those 2 guest spots, or did you see it more as having to almost like pay an expansion fee in order to have those 2 spots become available?
So those are all discussions that we would have to have with MLS and with the other leagues. Again, I've said this over and over again. U.S. soccer should not be in the business of ramming things down people's throats. And U.S. soccer should not be in the business of jumping into private businesses. But what we can do is make our interests known, make sure people are giving due consideration to our interests. And if we can broker using our leverage and our relationships and incentivizing leagues through other things that we can do with them and help them to achieve this, then we can do it. Now, the details we have to work out. So, for example, people are going to say, well, what about a stadium? What if it becomes, that a lower division team just does not want to take the risk of paying for a larger stadium to come into MLS, because MLS will say, listen, we're not going to have our people go and play in 2,000, 3,000 seat stadiums. Well, that's fine. What you can say is, if you're a lower division team coming up, you're going to get more sponsorship money for your jersey and otherwise just by virtue of being in MLS. You're going to get more revenue from the gate because you're going to have bigger crowds. If you still do not want to invest in leasing or doing whatever you need to get a bigger stadium, you don't have to accept a promotion spot. But we think that ultimately it is going to be financially better for you. And so those are the kind of things we can work out. People are going to say, well, what about administration? There's a lot of HR and other administrative services that MLS provides for its teams that maybe the NASL or USL doesn't. Well, we can work together and say, when you're a guest, we can all chip in and pay a fee and utilize the pooled administrative resources, or you can continue to do things however you'd like. So there are lots of things that will have to be addressed, but those are all things that can very easily be worked out. It's with respect to buying in, your question about actually paying a fee to everyone in MLS just to have the honor of the guest spot. Again, that is part of a negotiation. Mm-hmm. MLS doesn't need that money. We can't expect that one of the lower division teams is going to be able to come up with enough capital to really make it a massive investment. And by the way, unlike the MLS teams that are putting in that money for a permanent spot in MLS, what are you asking the guest team to put up money for? Just the mm-hmm. right to play for one season potentially, if it gets relegated again. So those are kind of things that I think when you're sitting down, the folks in MLS have done extraordinarily well on the business side. You're talking about sophisticated business people. The NASL has got extremely successful, sophisticated business people. I've sat down with folks on, with folks on all those sides, USL as well. These are things that we can work out. These are things that I've been doing for 17 years with much bigger companies, with much more at stake. This is something we'll be able to do. It won't be easy, but we'll be able to do it.
Well, one of the things you mentioned previously that you've done was hired a head coach for the Staten Island Vipers, I believe it was. Mm-hmm. But you've also said you don't want to ramp things down fans' throats. That's not something U.S. Soccer should be doing. But I did want to ask, do you have thoughts about who you would appoint if you were elected to be the next head coach of the men's national team? Or is that something that you would maybe go about establishing via committee or via boardroom decision?
Yeah, that is absolutely, as I've said, with my number one and key strategic initiative. Critical decisions have to be made through an inclusive, merit-based, and transparent process. I have thoughts on qualities for a national team coach. It's a very different position than a full-time coach, with a professional team where you're able to work with players for many years and you've got them, you're dealing with them every single day in trainings and you can get a lot more done. A national team coach needs to be able to pick players, figure out very quickly which players will play together the best in what system, and really manage them in a way that you're going to set them up to succeed. It's a different. You have a lot less time with those players, so different qualities I think that you need. And of course, there are names out there that I think are great. I think Tab Ramos, Peter Vermes are names that come to mind of great coaches that I would think would be part of the consideration. But that is a decision that is just not going to be made by me. It's going to be made by a committee with ex-national team coaches, current ex-national team players, business folks, because the choice of a coach may have an impact on business. Different folks will have different weight in their views, but it's got to be a committee of experts where you gain a consensus and you're vetting this decision to make sure that it absolutely makes sense for U.S. soccer.
All right. Well, final round of questions, or maybe just the final question. This coming Saturday is obviously the election. What is the rest of your week looking like in terms of contacting voters, seeing who is out there who maybe remains undecided, or what are you going to be doing to kind of solidify your position heading into that election?
I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing. I'll be reaching out to a lot of the members, having a dialogue with them, talking about my strengths. One of the things that people are becoming more and more acutely aware of as we get closer is you need to focus and you need to pick people whose ideas resonate. And you got to scratch a little bit beneath the surface to make sure, pressure test those ideas. But you also need to make sure once you find folks with good ideas and good qualities, that the person can actually implement them, that the person can actually deliver when he or she gets into office. And I think people are realizing that this is a soccer organization. You need a deep soccer background, which I've got from all perspectives. And you also need that deep business perspective and experience to be able to actually lead a board, bring constituencies together, and get this job done. So I'm going to just keep talking with folks, talking about what's on their minds, hear what's on their minds, talk through issues, and get down to Orlando, continue to do the same thing, and go into the election with a full head of steam. I think we've got a lot of momentum that's been building. I think the press is picking up on that. I was able to get into the Final Four for the Athlete Council. I think that call went very well with them on Friday. So, just keep the momentum going and head down to Orlando for the vote.
And in terms of the vote, because I'm assuming that you have a bit more insight than we do, how do you envision at least like the start of voting to go? Is it just sort of like all of the different voting blocks are asked to cast their ballots? Is it you candidates sitting around waiting to hear what happens? What exactly starts that day?
Yeah, well, you'd be surprised to know that we have not been given a tremendous amount of clarity ourselves over the process. I don't know the finer points of it, but I can tell you that I can tell you what we know, which is we will be in the room. We will each have some allotment of time. I think currently it's 5 minutes to give an address to the electorate, and then they will vote. People will push buttons, and at the end, the votes will be tallied on a screen. And if there's no winner, which is somebody with the majority, just one vote over 50%, then we'll go 10 minutes of caucusing, and we'll do it all again until there's a winner.
All right. Well, Michael Winograd, thank you so much again for taking the time, and best of luck to you this weekend.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.